Unto the Hills by Margaret Walker Freel. Chapter 24. Margaret lay alone in her bed. She was physically and emotionally exhausted. She watched the moonlight forming patterns on her bed, and it occurred to her that this was a beautiful sight. Suddenly, she was wide awake. She felt that her mind had again begun to function, and that she would be able to face the future. She had to be realistic. In her mind, Margaret felt that she had lived 1,000 years in the past 36 hours. Life of the young girl she had been and the happy matron she had become as the wife of Squire Walker was no longer hers. She was alone. She could not depend upon the love and admiration of her strong, noble husband. Never again would she be the aristocratic and envied mistress who presided over a plantation household. Though she was only 39 years of age, she was a woman weary with years. An old and spent woman with 2 sons still in the horrible war. The mother of 3 small frightened children looking to her for comfort. Those little ones, though they had not gone to go fight in the war, were not untouched by it. They had seen their home ravaged and their father abducted. Margaret crept from her bed and looked out on the landscape bathed in moonlight. Before grasping the realities of the present and the future, Margaret allowed her mind the luxury of going over the past. There was her grandfather, James Scott, who had left his homeland to come to the New World in order to find the freedom that he'd been denied in Scotland. Her own father, John Scott, who had fought in the War of 1812. Things never had been easy. Why should she expect them to be easy for her? A feeling of comfort and peace stole over her. She remembered her talks with Billy and what he had said about the land. Here was still the land. When the Yankees raided the place, they carried off everything they could get their hands on, but they hadn't burned down the house and they hadn't hurt the land. People were wrong when they said men fought wars for money. The good earth was the only thing worth fighting for. It was the only thing permanent in the world. The land is where food and material for clothing comes from. There in the moonlight, in the sanctuary of her own room, which she had so recently shared with her beloved Billy, Margaret made a vow to fight and to win. She would keep her land, and from it she would feed and clothe her children. She would not give up. Billy's last words to her were, "Do the best you can." This she would do, and she would win. Quietly the door opened, and Mary Scott peered into the room. "Are you all right, Margaret?" she asked. "Did you get any sleep?" "Yes, Mother. I slept some, and I do feel better." "Good. Why are you at the window?" "I was awakened by the bright moonlight and came over to look. It is so peaceful, and everything looks so beautiful. It's as if God is watching over all of us." Then I started thinking. Billy was right about the Irish people fighting for land. This war has been a cruel tragedy, but we aren't completely defeated. We still have the land, and I'll give my life if necessary to keep it for my children. All our people have had hardships. You, Mother, have not had things easy, but you didn't give up, and neither will I. I'm no different from those who fought their battles before me, and with God's help, I'll win mine." Mary smiled at her daughter. "You are feeling better. It's that will to fight and to win that makes us able to face the hardships and the things that look hopeless for a time. There are many endings in this life before the final ending in death. However, with each of the endings, there is a new beginning which you must face. How you face each new beginning is up to you. Life is never easy. We are mortal. To mortals, nothing comes easy, unless maybe it's grief and sorrow. Right now, you are suffering the worst loss a woman is ever asked to face. To lose one's parents or one's children is heartbreaking, but to lose one's mate is the greatest loss of all. A man, a woman, through the marriage vows, become one. Christian marriage is one of God's greatest gifts. When one of the partners of marriage is taken away by death, this is the deepest sorrow. It does not heal. Tears can help wash away some of the grief. I hope you can cry good, strong tears that may ease your pain. No one has a monopoly on sorrow, but each must face it in his own way. Sorrow is a part of life. To live, we must rebuild on the shattered fragments of what is left of the old life. Don't use sorrow as a crutch, but rather turn from it to service and duty. Help others who are also suffering. Thank you, Mother, not only for saying those words to me now as I need to listen to them, but also thank you for having lived the kind of life that shows me, even more than your words, how to face my sorrow and how to stand strong as I face whatever is in store for me. As Margaret finished her last sentence, her voice grew trembly, and she bowed her head as tears began running down her cheeks. She knelt in front of her mother and placed her head in her mother's lap, at last gave vent to the tears that she had not shed. She sobbed convulsively for a time, then she raised her head, and in a steady, clear voice she said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Chapter 25. A new day and a new life had begun for Margaret. The next morning she went to the trading post to see what she could do with the meager stock that was remaining. While she was there, David Adams came in with the mail. David hesitated at the door before entering. He had heard of the raid on the Walker house, and the idea of bringing more war news to Margaret seemed heartless. "Come in, David," greeted Margaret. "Is there any news about the war?" "Nothing good, I'm afraid," he responded. "We have to face all kinds," said Margaret, "good or bad." "What is it?" "It's that General Sherman, he's still on the march. After burning and destroying everything in a 60-mile wild slash through Georgia, he captured Atlanta, pillaged and burned everything, and then went on to Savannah. After Savannah, he turned north and about destroyed Columbia, South Carolina. He's in North Carolina now, fighting against Johnston. There's more bad news from Virginia. General Grant is taking everything in front of him there. Looks mighty bad everywhere." Margaret shook her head sadly. "As you say, it's certainly bad. It's getting worse every day." While Margaret and David were talking, others began arriving at the post to hear the latest war news. Polly Tatham entered with tears in her eyes and started telling her news in breathless gasps. "A soldier just came by," and at this point she broke down completely. Margaret went to her and put her arms around her neighbor, saying, "Polly, what has happened now?" Polly finally regained control and continued her story. "General Lee's army in Virginia is defeated. They surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse." She paused. There was total silence. "Did you hear what I said? Lee surrendered." She began to sob again. "Oh my God," gasped Abram Collett. "We're whipped. What in the name of God will happen now?" Then his face changed. "Great jumping Jehoshaphat, that means our boys can come home. My Hugh can come home." Once again his face changed to sadness as he finished his statement. "That is, if he ain't dead already." "The last we heard, Agnew was in prison. Wonder when they'll let him come home. From what we've heard about the prisons, you wonder whether they were able to live through that ordeal." By now, Mrs. Tatham had recovered sufficiently to talk again. "This is a sad day for us. The saddest day our South will ever have. Our youngest boy got transferred to General Vaughn's army, and when they had to give up Richmond, he was with the troops that escorted President Davis. Then he was a messenger and got to be in on the last council meeting President Davis held with his cabinet. That was a privilege and honor he'll be proud to tell his children and grandchildren about someday." "I know you were proud of him, Polly," said Margaret. "I hope he and all the boys will be home soon. It'll be wonderful to have our families together again. That is, the ones who are still alive. There's still much to be concerned over. Captain Francis, how do you think things will turn out now?" "I'm afraid that's something I can't answer. I just don't know. There will be many problems. I do think the armies will soon be discharged, but all the fighting is not over. There are still bad feelings. This causes people to do strange things." Bad news continued to be the only news coming into the trading post. The news of General Johnston's surrender to Sherman near Durham, North Carolina, did nothing to lighten the spirits of the listeners. As they were discussing this latest bit of information, Major Whittaker rode up. He dismounted and, with tears in his eyes, said, "Gentlemen and ladies, I have today surrendered to General Kirk in Franklin. I was the last to surrender in North Carolina. It's a sad day for all of us. I guess it's the saddest day in my whole life. We are whipped and will have to suffer whatever consequences may be the result of this war, and God only knows what that'll be. We in North Carolina have much to be proud of in our efforts in this war. We sent more than our quota of men. They said 1/2 of the muskets at Appomattox were from North Carolina. About 42,000 of our young men were casualties of this war. Men, it just about killed me to have to surrender today in Franklin. Major, don't forget to tell what Cherokee County did. I'm proud of that too. We had over 2,000 enlistments," Captain Francis added to the Major's comments. Steve Whittaker stepped up to Margaret and said, "Mrs. Walker, I'm sorry to hear about your trouble. This here store ain't the same anymore. Squire Walker and me have been neighbors ever since we landed in Indian country. How are you getting along?" "Thank you, Captain Whittaker. I'm thankful I have a roof over my head and wood to burn. No, things can't ever be the same again. My 2 oldest boys are still not home. I don't have anybody to send to Walhalla for goods, and even if I did have, well, there isn't any money to buy anything, and for that matter, there isn't anything to be had. Everybody around here is about in the same circumstances. About all we have left is our good land. I'm thinking about closing the trading post. I'll move the post office over to the inn." Several of the bystanders added condolences and promises to help Margaret with supplies for her home. As this was going on, Grandsire Whittaker entered and announced, "It looks like everything's happened but the end of time, and sometimes I think that would be better than what we've got." "Now what?" chorused many of the men. "Well, you know Lincoln was elected president for the 2nd time. He held his first cabinet meeting and told them he hoped there wouldn't be any persecution and reprisal towards the South because of the war. Then what happens but a crazy lunatic shot him dead at Ford's Theater." "Great God Almighty!" exclaimed Captain Whittaker. "Killed the president? What will happen now?" "You're right to call on the Almighty. We sure do need him. Andy Johnson will take over now. He's from North Carolina, but I'm afraid he isn't the man Abe Lincoln was. Everybody cussed Lincoln, but I believe he tried to do what was right." "You're right, Paul," said Steve. "He wasn't the son of a bitch we all called him. I think, if the truth is told, he did try to do right." Margaret added, "Grandsire, you're right. Lincoln did try to do what was best for the country. He will go down in history as a great and good man. But I fear the future now will be worse than our war. We're going to have to work all the harder to hold on to our land. As Grandsire said, we'll have to call on the Almighty a little harder." Indeed, there were bad times ahead. President Davis was captured and imprisoned. There was talk of his paying for his service to the Confederacy with his life. Governor Vance was arrested and put in prison in the Capitol at Washington. President Johnson appointed Vance's political antagonist Holden as provincial governor of North Carolina. At the same time, he removed from office every state and county official in the state. The Southland humbly accepted the terms of surrender and, hard as it was, took oath of allegiance. Then the nation confronted how the states who seceded could be brought back into the Union. Lincoln had formulated a plan which was working in Tennessee. When a state had 1/10 as many voters as it had in 1860, it could then set up its own government and would receive its old rights if the voters took the oath of allegiance to the United States. Congress did not adopt this plan, and the Southern delegates were not accepted. Congress passed the Reconstruction Bill and put all states except Tennessee under military rule. It would be a period of 8 years before a delegate from North Carolina would again be seen in the Congress of the United States. Chapter 26. Margaret threw herself into the hard work of reconstruction of her own surroundings. She used the curative power of hard work for a twofold purpose. First, she labored to reclaim that which was hers, and second, to keep her mental balance. As she worked, she planned for the future. When evening came, she was so exhausted her only recourse was rest, which left little or no time to regret the past. The blacks that had been on the plantation before the war chose to remain. Pitt was soon released from duty and returned healthy and able to add his labors to those of the ones at home. Agnew, Margaret's oldest son, was still not heard from. Margaret continued to watch for him, or, at the very least, prayed to hear from him so that she would know whether he were alive or dead. Gradually, through their own hard efforts and with the aid of their neighbors, the Walker farm began to produce food and clothing for the inhabitants. At last, Margaret's prayers were answered. Agnew came home. Margaret gathered him into her arms and wept tears of joy. His thin, emaciated body showed the effects of his long stay in the Yankee prison camp. "Thank God, Agnew, you're home at last." She held him from her so she could look at him. Agnew was also delighted. "Imagine, here I am back in old Valleytown. Sometimes I was afraid I would never see this place again. As you say, thank God." Margaret was so excited she continued to run on in typical motherly fashion concerning his health, his illness, and how she would restore him to health with her cooking and the good farm produce. Of course, one of the questions uppermost in Agnew's mind was the whereabouts of his father. "Mother, I hate to mention sad things, but I have to know. Have you heard anything from Father?" The joy left Margaret's face and her eyes misted as she answered, "No, Agnew. I have never heard a thing but rumor. I'm sorry. I was so hoping that in all this time you would have heard something. I thought he might have been in prison and maybe would have been able to get in touch with you by now." "Nothing." Then she added, "Rumor has it that they took him and kept him in prison in Knoxville for a while. Then they took him to Camp Douglas at Rock Island in Illinois. I've written to Washington and can't get a thing. The Masons have tried to get news, but rumor is all we know. I believe, though, that these rumors are true. Agnew, as hard as it is to face, your father won't be coming home. God only knows how I miss him." Then she forced her face to brighten. "But now, let's go to the kitchen and get some food for you." The evening was filled with excitement as Agnew and Pitt talked of their experiences while away from home. The younger boys, as is typical of younger brothers who have to remain at home, envied their older brothers and secretly wished they had been old enough to join in the fight for their country. The next morning, when Margaret went to the garden to gather her vegetables, she heard a sound beyond the hedge. She went over to investigate. There she saw Agnew. He was sitting on the ground, with his head in his hands, and he was sobbing deep, painful sobs of one racked with pain and grief. She quietly sat beside him and held his frail body to hers as she allowed him to drain his sorrow with his tears. Finally, when he appeared to have reached the limit of tears, she softly said, "Tell me. It will help." "Oh, Mother, I miss Father so. It's all so different here. Everything's changed. I had thought if only I could get home, everything would be the same, but it isn't. He's gone. Everything is different. I don't feel like I can stand it. I know you've had a hard time and I should be helping you. You're right. You're still weak and ill. When you get your strength back, things will begin to look better." She paused, struggling for the right words to say. "I know it's a shock to you to find everything so changed here at home, and let's face it, it'll never be the same. Even if nothing had changed here, you have changed. You left here a mere boy of 17. You returned a man of 19. You became a man because of what you went through during the war, not because of the passage of 2 years' time. You see us now through the eyes of a man who has seen death, destruction, all the horrors of war. You've experienced hunger and filth and illness. How could you possibly remain the same sheltered lad who left us with visions of the glories of war and the winning for what we thought was a just cause? But mother, was his anguished retort, it's almost like I want to run away. I want to hide. I want to erase the stench and death, the dying and the pain. What do I want? You want to erase these past 2 years. Oh my God, how I wish we could. Sometimes I have felt exactly the same, but it won't go away. It happened. Life goes on. We have to face a stern future. You want to run away. Would that we could run away. But where would we go that memory wouldn't be with us? You must face tomorrow just as you faced the tomorrows on the battlefield. I'm sure there were times even then that you felt that you couldn't take it anymore, but you did, and you survived, and you've been given the privilege of returning home. I wonder, Agnew, have we learned anything from this war? The Union had been saved. I guess we were wrong in thinking it would be divided. Slavery has been abolished. Legally, now all men in this country are free. I guess man will never learn that wars are not solutions. It brings sorrow to everyone, the victor as well as the victim. There are northern families sorrowing over the loss of their loved ones just as we are here in the South. Sorrow's no respecter of persons. It comes to the high and the low, and if we're willing to face the reality of it, we bring a lot of the sorrow on ourselves. People react differently to sorrow. Some gain strength and grow from it, others falter. We must look to the future and be strong. Did you read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? We in the South criticized him, but history, I think, will give him an honored place as one of our greatest leaders. He expressed a feeling for people that few leaders have felt. When Lincoln said, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." That is how we must feel. We must think that your father has not given his life in vain. Agnew, you've been a fine soldier. Now you must be a man. You have many talents. Use them. Agnew was listening intently to his mother's words. His tears had ceased. Though he made no comment, Margaret felt that her words were getting to him, so she continued, "It may help you to hear the experiences of others. At Appomattox, Lee, one of the greatest men of our time, laid down his arms because he felt further bloodshed was useless. At first, his sympathies, like your father's, were with the Union, but when his state seceded, he felt his duty was there. He then refused my cousin Winfield's request that he, Lee, become commander-in-chief of the Union forces. He's now trying to take up his life where he left off. We had our Appomattox, son, but the battle is not over for us. It could be the greatest one still ahead. It will take great people to win this battle." "Mother," at last Agnew spoke, "I know about these famous people, and I'm sure that they have and are serving their country well. But what about us, the little people? We've given so much. We've given our youth. We've given up dreams. Most of all, we've given Father. How have you been able to stand it and face it with such courage?" Margaret smiled a wan smile. It would have been easier at times to have given up and succumbed to self-pity. Then, with a proud toss of her head, she added, "But us mountain folk are made of sterner stuff. Losing your father is a sorrow that is with me always and will be to my dying day. The other battles I can face, and with God's help, I can win. We have faced starvation, but we are daily winning that battle as we work and slave and grow our food in this good land that has been entrusted to our care. We are still facing poverty. We have no money, and this land upon which we are dependent for our very existence is still partially unpaid for. We still owe the Wog estate and also your grandfather's estate. I must and I will somehow meet those debts. Your father was an honest man, and even in his death, I will see that his honest debts are repaid. No one could remain in Margaret's presence for long without becoming infected by her perpetual optimism and being impressed by her courage, least of all Agnew, her oldest child, who loved her dearly. He smiled at his mother, stood up tall, and reached down to offer her his hand to lift her. Together they returned to the house, both with renewed hope and strength. Chapter 27. Agnew tried to fit into the family again, and hoped to be able to relieve his mother of some of the burden that she'd been carrying since his father's abduction. He went to the trading post and was in the process of taking stock of the remaining items when some of the men from town dropped in. Even though there was little reason to go to the trading post these days, it was still the central meeting place. There were pleasant greetings and much pleasure at seeing old friends for the first time since the return from the war. The most effusive moments were followed by a silence which was broken when John Tatham said, "Things sure are different around here." There were nods of agreement, and Agnew said, "You're sure right. Nothing seems the same." Then he turned to the subject of the war. "John, I hear you were in federal prison for a while. Which one?" "I was captured in Gordon's attack on Fort Stedman. That was an experience I'd just as soon forget." "You had your turn in one, so I hear." "Yep. I just gotten out of the hospital and back to my regiment when I was captured. I don't know which was worse, the hospital with all the wounded and dying, or prison with all the starving and wondering if you would live to get out. I was in prison at Point Lookout. It was bad, but I hear the one at Camp Douglas in Illinois where they took my father was even worse." John Stewart, who had enlisted with Agnew, was standing by the counter and hadn't had much to say until someone asked, "How many battles were you in, John?" "If I kept count right, I was in 22 battles. I guess when you're at war, there's not much time for too much thinking and keeping track of things. Sometimes they would all seem to blur into one, day and night, marching week after week. Agnew and I were together till he got sick and was sent to the hospital. I guess all in all, we're both pretty lucky. The nearest I came to getting hit was being knocked down by a fallen tree that was hit by a cannonball." There was another pause, then John Stewart added, "What we need to think about now is what we're going to do with our lives. The war's over, and rehashing it is living in the past. During the war, I made a vow to use the rest of my life serving God, and I intend to do it. I've been thinking about going someplace else, maybe even another state. Somehow the idea of going to Texas sounds good. It's a young state, and they say it has many opportunities." John Tatham seemed to think this was a good idea. "I agree with you. I don't believe I want to stay here. I don't much think I'd like to quite go so far as Texas. I've been thinking about moving across the county into Chpts Valley. I hear they may decide to make a new county. What about you, Agnew?" "I don't know yet. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Sometimes I feel I ought to stay here and help Mother. She needs me. But the other boys seem to want to stay close to home. It does sound tempting, you know, going to a completely new place, striking out on my own." Joseph Stewart, who had also served in the Thomas Legion, shook his head in disagreement. "You fellers can go off to Jericho if you wish, but me, I think I'll stay right here in Valleytown. This is the place I dreamed of all the time I was out there marching and shooting, and I am so glad to be here. I'm going to stay right here." With this, there was some pleasant laughter, and the men returned to their daily chores, each planning his future in his own way. Following the war, Cherokee County had gone forward as best it could with county government. Provisional Governor W. Holden of North Carolina sent a commission to William Herbert to swear in justices of the peace. These were chosen and commissioned by the governor: A. Bell, G. W. Crawford, J. W. Shearer, G. F. Rose, J. M. Grant, H. B. Hyatt, B. K. Dickey, W. C. Evans, J. C. Axley, N. D. McCombs, S. W. Davidson, D. Hennessy, J. L. McDonald, J. J. Lovingood, H. Lovingood, G. W. Ferguson, M. B. Crisp, D. E. Hyde, E. G. Hyde, E. G. Morrow, and William T. Green. This body elected J. M. Grant as chairman of the county court. One of the humiliations of losing the war was having to submit to the signing of the oath of allegiance of all the citizens of the South. In Cherokee County, the court appointed a committee of 3 for all sections of the county. James Whitaker, David Hennessy, and E. G. Morrow were appointed for Valleytown. Though they were reluctant, the committee set about to perform its duty. They met at the trading post, ready to take the signatures of the people of the valley. Old Thomas C. Tatham entered and proclaimed himself their first customer. "Men, I know what you're here for, and I decided to lead the way. It's a hard thing to do, but as the old saying goes, it's better to run through the fire than to walk through. So here goes. Give me the paper to sign." With a flourish, he signed the paper, then turned and with much dignity spat on the floor, saying, "Now, boys, does that satisfy you?" He looked inquiringly at all 3. Hennessy answered, "Yes, Mr. Tatham, that's all. But don't blame us. We didn't want this job. Just like you're signing that paper. We're only doing what we're ordered to do." "Oh, I know." Tatham softened a little. "I just had to complain to somebody." Since there was no one else waiting to take the oath at that particular time, the men started talking with Agnew. Whitaker said, "Agnew, we sure miss your pa. He was a good man. Your mother's had a hard time, but she does seem to be standing up under the burden." "Has any more been heard from your pa?" asked Morrow. "I hoped he would get to come home after the war and they were releasing the prisoners." "We all sure hope the same thing. I think Mother has faced the fact that he won't be coming home. She wrote Washington but didn't learn a thing. We heard rumors that he'd been taken up north to a prison camp. He must have died there. I've heard that Camp Douglas prison was one of the worst." "Did your mother ever tell you how it happened?" "She told me some, but it's hard for her to talk about it." "I guess it is. But you ought to know as much about it as we know. Did she tell you what happened to the man who was leader of the gang of raiders that took your pa?" "No, she never mentioned him. I never heard her mention a name even." "Well," said Hennessy, "his name was Bryson. He was from over Nantahala way. He was one of the Union sympathizers, but we all felt he went too far in his zeal. When the Confederate troops were organized, he joined Captain Cooper's company over on Chiowa. Along towards the last of the war, lots of people did not remain in the Confederate ranks. Many saw it was a losing cause and they wanted to be on the winning side. Some were open deserters. Others toted on both sides, and you couldn't tell where they stood. Bryson joined the deserters and was made a captain. He led the band of men that carried your pa away. They did a lot of other devilment. Folks got sick and tired of it. Finally, they rose up in rebellion against the crew. Right or wrong, I don't know which, they did something about it. They got guns and gathered up a band of Indians. The Indians around here were all Confederate sympathizers. Bryson was on foot going to Tennessee. The Indians followed him by tracking him in the leaves. They overtook him on Long Ridge and killed and buried him on the side of the road. It was a terrible thing to do, but after all, it was the same as he'd been doing to others." Agnew was quiet for a while following this recitation. His head was bowed. Finally he said, "Thank you for telling me the story. This war was as cruel at home as it was on the battlefield. Both my father and Mr. Bryson were casualties of the war, just like some of the other men I saw shot down in front of my eyes." With a shudder, he added, "Would that I could erase those sights from my mind." The older men stood in silence as they saw before them a young man grown old before his time by the harrowing experiences of war. Questions entered their minds, questions that are still unanswered and will forever go unanswered as long as man continues to try to settle differences by the use of war. Man's inhumanity to man will never be understood. That year, the 4th of July was celebrated with the usual religious service and dinner on the church grounds. Though there was thankfulness over the wars being over, the obvious vacancies created by those who would never return from war cast a somber cloud over the gathering. Practically every family that had given a loved one, and all were faced with the future of trying to return to a semblance of normalcy in the face of poverty and grief. Margaret had reached the point of having to do something about the trading post. In view of the lack of supplies and the greater lack of funds, she decided the only course of action was to close the post. This brought up the question of the post office. Her plan was to remove the post office from the store to her home. However, this raised the question of whether the provisional government, which was, of course, made up of Union sympathizers, would be willing for her to serve as postmistress in Squire Walker's stead. Margaret decided to discuss her plan with one of the older leaders of the community. She approached Mr. Tatham at the 4th of July picnic. "I'd like to talk with you," she said, as the celebration was drawing to a close. "I've come to the conclusion that it would be useless to attempt to keep the trading post going. I think I should close it, at least for the present. That brings up the question of the post office. I would like to keep it, but you know how things are now. They're taking everything away from people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. I fear they will soon take it away from me. I've thought up a scheme. As the old saying goes, there's more than one way to choke a dog on butter. I wonder if we could arrange to have some Union person to sign the papers and reports for me so that I can continue to keep the post office. Do you think that would work?" "Why, Mrs. Walker, you sure are a smart woman." Mr. Tatham looked at her admiringly. "Did you have some particular person in mind?" Margaret smiled conspiratorially. "Yes, I do. That's the one reason I decided to talk to you. I was thinking about Mr. James Wright up at Red Marble Gap. He's your son's wife's father. Would you speak to your daughter-in-law and see if she will talk to her father and get his reaction to the plan? Of course, I would make some recompense. I couldn't pay much, for I don't have it. I had thought of giving him a barrel of flour a year for the deal. What do you think of that? Also, if you stop to think of it, Mr. Wright is the only Union man in the valley. We were all Confederates. There are plenty of others in other sections, but not here in Valleytown." "You're right. I don't see anything wrong with your plan either. Most of us would hate to see the post office moved away from here. I'll talk with my son and his wife today. We'll let you know tomorrow how the old man reacted to the suggestion." On the following morning, after being assured her plan was approved, Margaret tearfully locked the trading post and moved the little pigeon-holed box to her home. This could not be accomplished without a deep sense of loss and sadness. Margaret, in spite of her determination to put the past behind her, caught herself deep in nostalgic memory and a yearning for the happy days of the past. She shook these thoughts from her mind. She couldn't help being thankful for the demanding schedule of feeding and clothing her large family to keep her body and mind occupied and to prevent her from indulging in self-pity and sorrow. So the long, work-filled days of summer merged into the crisp, colorful days of fall and the gathering of the harvest. As she worked, it occurred to Margaret that there was more than the usual similarity to this coming Thanksgiving season with that of the first Pilgrims in Massachusetts. With the toil of their hands and from the sweat of their brow, they had wrestled from the earth provisions to sustain life for another year. With her entire family gathered around her on Thanksgiving Day, Margaret silently and prayerfully gave thanks for the table so bountifully set and for the health that they had been blessed with in order to have the strength to provide for their needs. "Boys," she said as dinner was drawing to a close, "I feel that I want to talk a while. It isn't often that I want to preach a sermon, but today is a special day and there is much I want to share with you." How good it was to see all 5 of her boys at the tables with her, and how intently did they all respond to her statement. Margaret continued, "Today is the 4th Thursday of November, Thanksgiving Day. In 1863, this day was set aside by President Lincoln for a national celebration. These last years have brought great hardship and grief to most of this nation's people. Yet the Lord has been kind. The earth and God have provided us with this dinner, for which we are grateful and thankful. There were Thanksgiving observances long before Lincoln set this day aside as a national holiday. It started many years ago, and it is fitting that our family should observe this day. This day is one of mankind's oldest religious rites. Moses wrote, 'When thou hast gathered in the fruit of the barn floor and of the winepress, thou shalt make merry in the festival time. Thou, thy son, thy daughter, and the stranger within thy gate.' It had as its beginning in the New World in 1619, when the colonists arrived in New England, when Captain John Woodard said, 'It has been a yearly and perpetually kept holiday of Thanksgiving.' Again, the Pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower, when they had so little, Governor Bradford had them observe it in 1621. The father of our country, George Washington, also observed it in 1789. I want my boys to think today about what we have to be thankful for. First, God and the good earth have been kind to us. We have a table covered with good food once more. We also have food and forage stored for us and our animals for the winter. Let us not forget the little things that we generally take for granted. Let us be glad that we can see, we can hear, taste, feel, and smell. We can walk and talk. We have our health. We are united as a mother and her 5 sons. We must remember things that are not physical or material. We must be thankful for the unseen things of God's providence upon which our souls may grow strong. The beauty of the earth around us and the heavens above us. We live in a lovely valley. We have the blessings of family, friends, fellowship, and brotherhood. We have the great heritage of our forefathers. The knowledge of God's kindness gives us faith and hope for the future. We must always remember, too, our precious liberty is not a gift to be taken lightly, but a responsibility for which we must work in order to earn the right thereof. We must be thankful for what we have been blessed with, and we must dedicate our lives in such a way as to leave our country richer and better for having had the privilege of sharing it. Never let a day unhallowed pass. Remember what the Lord has done."